Support for Paradox comes from the Timothy Center, your online counseling center, no matter where you live. The Timothy Center is a marriage and family counseling facility in Austin, Texas, offering distance consultations for those that live outside the Austin area. If you have questions and you'd like to consult with Jimmy, Josh, or one of their licensed professionals, visit them at timothycenter.com. Recording live from Austin, Texas, a conversation about marriage and family that women will love and guys won't want to turn off. Dr. Jimmy Myers and Dr. Josh Myers are a paradox.
Hey.
Guys, welcome to the show. I'm Paradox, and this is Jimmy.
And I'm Josh. Welcome. If you listened for any length of time, you know that little comedy routine got our names exactly backwards. Because I just don't want people to confuse the voice of wisdom with the voice of youthful ignorance.
But I said, I'm Paradox, and this is Jimmy, meaning the show is called Jimmy. And then you said you're Josh.
It's the Jimmy Show. That is, I think, an apt name change.
So Paradox and Josh are the hosts of the Jimmy Show.
Yes. Make it so.
Yep.
Something to throw in here real quick. Had a really good time Saturday speaking at Hill Country Bible Church. Large group of parents and, come to find out, non-parents that were there. I was there speaking about, well, the name of what it is Children and Pornography, a Crisis. And all of our certified sexual addiction therapists at the Timothy Center are kind of fanning out in the Central Texas area speaking on this topic. So, should there be anyone listening that would like one of us to come, just holla.
Not me.
No, you don't do it.
Speaking makes me nervous.
Which is so weird, because you're relatively good at it.
So I only say yes to my church. Yeah. Like
when we do Paradox events.
Podcast, I'll obviously do.
Yes.
But locally,
I don't think people know that the Paradox are for hire.
That's something I don't want them to know.
We are hired voices. But yeah, so anyway, I wanted to throw that out there in case there is, because that's something that we're really pushing right now. And again, they've probably heard it since we pushed it on here before. In 2018, 82% of all young men under 30 looking at porn weekly. And as of 2019, the average age of first exposure is now between 8 and 11. So yeah, you can see why it's sort of a high priority issue.
Anytime you talk about porn, a little part in me dies. Look at that segue.
Oh, I like that.
Huh?
Speaking of dying, today we're talking about death.
More specifically, grief.
How to handle when a loved one dies. And we thought it was apropos since our family just went through this sort of, and it happens in every family, but it's something that we really don't think about all that much. We certainly don't talk about it all that much, but it is something that, again, is a common occurrence for all. It's just going to happen for everybody. And so we thought, since we had just kind of come out of that really tumultuous time
then
period,
in our culture, just had Kobe Bryant and his daughter and the 5 others.
Like that. So when I was at KERC Curse Radio, the Jimmy Myers Roadshow, bringing home from work in Eastland County, early on a Saturday morning, I am live. Beth came with me. She's sitting in the studio.
Similar to
and
now.
We go live. We're going live to Brian Reynolds. And so there's Brian, and he's just on a payphone at the county barn or wherever this was being held. And Brian said, I'm sitting here, and he says, I'm here with junior livestock show queen Debbie Hitt, which was Beth's best friend at the time. And so Beth, and if anyone knows, when you're in a radio studio and the mic is on, everything goes off. And there's no sound, no phone will ring. It's an open mic for this room. And so she's sitting there, and she goes, Debbie, is that you? And Debbie's sitting there being interviewed by Brian, goes, Beth? Is that you? Oh my gosh, I didn't know you were. Oh yeah, it was. And so they just start having this conversation.
How were the 5 listeners offended?
Well, 4. I don't want to, blow myself up in importance. There was
both
4.
your parents.
So we recently went through the passing of Beth's dad, which was Papa, a.k.a. Pops, a.k.a. Poops, at the age of 90. So there's a couple of things about when a family deals with the death of a patriarch. So we're not talking about necessarily here, but, the death of a friend or whatever. I think death is going to be, it's going to be similar. But here you've got somebody that the grandchildren know and know they're old, but really with 6 years old being the oldest of the 7 grandchildren, none of them really have real experience with someone passing. Therefore, there's two things going on here when you have the death of an aging parent/grandparent. And one of them is the abject sorrow that the child of the deceased has at the passing of their parent, a parent that has been in their life for their entire life. That's a struggle, even though you know it's coming, even though you absolutely know it's coming. And in Papa's case, it was hospice, and you knew it was coming. And yet the event itself is still very traumatic. You add to that, especially in Beth's case, she had like a decade of taking care of aging, dying parents, from doctor's appointments and medicines, and
rehab, and nursing,
and
skilled nursing,
Hoyers, and it was just, and medications and dealing with insurance company. It was a full-time job for a decade. Exhausting. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. We're going to talk more about, but that whole idea of I'm so exhausted, especially this last round with her dad, where it was hospital and then rehab and then skilled nursing and then hospice, and then it was just grueling. And there's an aspect of it of relief when they pass, especially when you have someone that so wanted to pass. We always joke, he was the most disappointed that he was still alive. And so there's that aspect of, oh my gosh, I feel a sense of relief, and yet, I feel horrible for feeling I shouldn't be feeling a sense of relief. And for caregivers and for caregiver fatigue, absolutely, that is an appropriate, normal feeling to have. Even from a biblical sense, if, he closed his eyes here and he opened them in glory, that is something to be, I'm glad he's not suffering. I'm glad this whole thing is over with, and he is now at peace and in paradise.
That's one of the things about grief that I tell my folks that come in for that to counseling is really the first rule for me, at least in grief work, is you have to give yourself grace, because you're going to feel so many different things, and some of the things you're going to feel are inappropriate, and then there's going to be guilt. And if you give yourself grace and take a deep breath and allow whatever emotion comes in to come in,
right,
they actually,
and not judge it.
Yes, they actually dissipate quicker. It's when we stress about and we think about it that it really builds. And so giving yourself grace to feel whatever it is you feel around the death of a loved one, I think, is important.
Now then, when you're talking about, and for most of our audience that's younger than would have young kids, how do you deal with that? Do you take them to the viewing? Do you tell them that he's dead and pushing up daisies? I mean, how far do you go? What can they understand? What can they not understand?
My son, 4, so he's in the middle, has seen, I think he's buried just 2 of his grandparents. We always take them up to the casket. So he has seen now 2 deceased people in a casket, and he thought that their legs were sawed off.
Because you couldn't see them.
Yes. And so we didn't know this, in his mind, the legs were, so you saw the body. And so when we were talking about Papa and how the funeral was going to be somewhere else, and we were like, his body is going to be taken to Glen Rose. And he was like, well, what about his head? Where's his head going to be? So you just pictured this disassembled body.
Well, you said the body.
His legs are staying, his brain, I don't know where his head is, but his body will be in Glen Rose. All right, now
Yeah, well, and I think it was at the viewing where, it was Jay who said, yeah, I don't want to see him in a box. So you have that. Y'all's approach has been, this is death, and here's a body that's been embalmed. And I remember at the graveside, you had Jay, and you're just going, well, I know you can't see it because there's this like green carpet, but there's a hole right there, and then he's going to be lowered. So you were walking him through everything there was to walk through. Now, there is another approach to this, which is I want them to remember Papa smiling and waving. So I'm not going to take them up to see him in the throes of death, as he's gasping his final.
By the way, that death rattle is terrible. The gurgling to breathe.
But I say all that to say, there's another, and I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent, just another way of looking at it is I don't want to expose my smaller children to this process.
Which is neither here nor there.
Yeah, but just at the end, and to your point, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You're not scarring them either way. It's just a different way of looking at
The
it.
only wrong thing, quote unquote, and we're not talking morally, we're more talking emotionally here. The only wrong way to go about it is to avoid it altogether.
Yes.
And that's when people get into trouble.
Yes.
There's no really one right way to grieve, but there is one wrong way, and that's to avoid it.
Yes.
And so if you are a parent of a young child and there's a death in the family, whether they go to the casket or not, whether they go see them on their deathbed or not,
Whether they're
as long as
curious
you're
about where
talking
their head
about it,
is.
and as long as you attend the funeral and not just avoid it completely.
Yeah. We always say that the parent sets the emotional tone of the home. Therefore, we don't want to be too angry. We don't want to show that we're nervous that the country is going to heck in a handbasket. We don't, so we're setting the emotional tone. And then you get to something like a funeral of a loved one where you're crying, you are showing intense emotions, and that's okay. Our children need to see that you're experiencing great sadness. We had two of the smaller ones kind of sitting with us, and both of them were sort of crying because they just saw everyone else crying.
They should have been on the third row.
They weren't crying.
With me. I had a 2 and a 4-year-old boy in my lap.
They weren't crying?
I had zero grieving. They were all over the place. I thought I was going to have to walk out of my own grandfather's funeral because of how crazy
both those
they
up
were.
here with us were girls, which again shows a little more of the emotional intuitiveness, even in small children. But, they would just say, oh, I miss Pop Pop. Not that they grasp everything that there was to grasp, but, everyone was sad. There was a giant picture of Pop Pop up there, and they picked up on this is a sad thing, and it is surrounding Pop Pop, and he is not here. To your point, to shelter them, to not take them, to I don't want to cry in front of the kid. To your point, there is no real wrong except that. That may be the wrong way to handle it, just to absolutely deny them this glimpse into life. And that this is not something to be avoided.
In 21st century America, we're very much separated from death.
Mm-hmm.
We don't go out into the back 40 anymore, kill the hog, skin it, flay it, and then throw the bacon on. Everything's handed to us. Obviously, that's how we get our meat, but we don't actually see it. And modern medicine is delaying death. And I know a lot of our listeners have experienced some intense death and loss. And so this obviously doesn't apply to everybody. But for the most part in our culture, we're very separated from the idea of death. And it's something that we have to deal with and accept.
And we were talking, there was a time 100 years ago, and in the grand scheme of things, that's nothing, where, someone would die and they're just put up on the dining room table at the house, and everyone comes and they have the funeral. I mean, it's just right there.
When there was higher infant mortality, so there was even losses of siblings, and we just don't experience that much anymore.
Death was much, much more a part of life. And to your point, it's very much more insular today, where we don't want to think about it, touch it, and that is to a disservice of our children. It's this thing of this thing dies and you eat it. We sing about the circle of life and Pumbaa and everything, but they don't see it. They don't see it in their lives until there's the death of a friend or a loved one, and then that's in some way sort of antiseptic. That's really sort of to our disservice because, again, if we ignore death, it in some way cheapens life and the way we live that.
So this is obviously a post-fall thing. We are intended to live forever. But death is actually God showing his grace to us. He sins, so after the fall, he sends Adam and Eve out of the garden so they wouldn't live together and so they wouldn't be cursed forever. So it's an interesting thing in that it's something that is terribly sad, but in a lot of ways to the deceased is such a gift. Death is God showing his grace to us so that we wouldn't live forever under this curse. Mm-hmm. And that we could experience freedom.
Yeah. And for our children to see how this fits into their faith, that our loved one, whoever it is, whether it's a friend of theirs who dies in a car crash or, a grandparent that everyone was expecting to die, whatever, that there is grace in that and there is joy in that. Not happiness, but there is joy in that if we believe what we say we believe then they're in this amazingly magical, wonderful, beautiful place, and we rejoice in that.
We talked about the passing of an elderly person. We've talked about, generally speaking, death and grieving. But I do know that, and we know that a lot of our listeners have experienced untimely deaths, which is a different conversation.
That sort of tragedy is a little different conversation.
I think same rules apply, right? Like giving yourself grace, and, the only wrong way is to not deal with it. Mm-hmm. But when you experience an untimely death, for me, when I work with folks, they have to feel all these negative things and walk through that forest to get to the other side. Grief, specifically an untimely death, looks like learning to not be defined by the loss of that person for the rest of your life, but flipping it and being thankful for the time you had with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if my soon-to-be a week 7-year-old daughter passes, I could be defined by that tragedy for the rest of my life and live in the what could have been. But I would need to work towards grieving and flipping it and being thankful for the 7 years I did have. There's people that would give their left arm for a biological child for 5 days. Mm-hmm. There's people that would kill to be able to be married and potentially foster and adopt a child and have a child at all. And so I got 7 years, and it does not happen overnight, and it doesn't happen over weeks or even months. But the grieving process, specifically for a death that is unexpected, looks like you stopping defining yourself by the tragedy and flipping it and being thankful for the time that you did have.
And boy, is that easier said than done. And boy, is that a process.
100%.
But that is where, it's been said that faith isn't faith until it's all you have. When something like that, some unthinkable, unimaginable tragedy like that happens, you're right. It's so easy to fall into the thinking pattern you just described, but to sit back and just say, okay, all this Sunday school, all these, this whole faith I've been claiming since I was a child, Scripture, the unshakable, inerrant, everlasting Word of God says to trust in Him with all your heart and not to lean on your own understanding. And in all your ways acknowledge Him. And He is going to straighten this out, and He's going to make His path visible and clear and His purposes clear. That's the goal. Sort of like Jesus saying, be perfect even as my Heavenly Father is perfect. Okay. That's our goal, is to shoot for that type of faith-based understanding.
Yes. And that doesn't, again, I've already said it, but I'll say it again. It doesn't take days, weeks, or months. It takes years to get there. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's unachievable in this life. Mm-hmm. And that's part of going back to giving yourself grace. If you want more information about this episode or anything previous, it's paradoxpodcast.com. You can also find our socials there. And we appreciate you listening, and we look forward to next week.
Paradox is produced by Billy Lee Myers Jr. and researched by Dr. Jimmy and Dr. Josh Myers. For more information about our Paradox evangelist, Julie Lyles-Carr, go to julielylescarr.com. If you want more details about what was discussed on today's show, go to paradoxpodcast.com.